Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar today. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to filter in and we will start with the webinar shortly. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's webinar, the do's and don'ts of post-incident analysis. Before we get started, I just want to run through the pace of the webinar and what you can expect from our presenters today. First, please know that all attendee lines are muted to control for any background noise. If you have a question at any time, feel free to send it through the question window located in the control panel. We will leave 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session with the presenters. To give you an idea of how the webinar will flow, today we will treat it more like a conversation. So again, if you have questions, please feel free to send them through and we'll address them at the end of the presentation in Q&A. Finally, the webinar will be recorded and made available to you via email and on demand, as well as on VictorOps.com within the next few days. With that in mind, I'd like to introduce Jason Hand and Jason Yee as our presenters today. Jason Hand is the DevOps evangelist at VictorOps, a modern alerting and incident management platform for responding to and resolving service disruptions. He is the author of the O'Reilly book, ChatOps Managing Operations with Group Chat, as well as ChatOps for Dummies. Jason also organizes DevOps Days Rockies and hosts many local DevOps-related meetups. Jason Yee is a technical writer and evangelist at Datadog. He works to inspire engineers with the power of metrics and monitoring and helps make it easier for developers to leverage Datadog's full capabilities. Jason also organizes DevOps Days Portland and stays connected to his PHP developer roots by organizing the DevOps track at DrupalCon. And with that in mind, I will let them take it away.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
So today we're going to be covering a bit about how to not only run post-incident analysis, but to give you guys some background, we're going to talk through a bit about service disruptions detection and diagnosis before actually jumping in, because those will help fuel how we actually do post-incident analysis. And then we'll follow up at the end by giving you a framework that you can use in your own situations to gather data.
Yeah, like Jason mentioned, most of this is on post-incident analysis, so things like postmortems, learning reviews, after-action reports. There's a lot of different names for the types of exercises we do after a service disruption or some sort of incident. And we're going to be blasting through a lot of content. Some of it is a little bit stuff that we could definitely talk for hours on, but we wanted to get right into the do's and don'ts. But again, like Jason mentioned, framing things and giving a little bit of context on some of the stuff we think is going to be valuable. But we're going to be sharing a lot of the things that we're talking about today on Twitter. So if you want to follow along on Twitter, we'll be using the hashtag #ViaWebinar. We mentioned earlier that you can submit questions through the actual webinar software, but you could also submit questions on Twitter, and we'll take a look at those at the end of the webinar as well.
Great, so let's get to it, right? Service disruptions. You know, we're dealing with modern complex systems, right? So it used to be that you'd have a server and you just install the LAMP stack and you have, you know, or some sort of stack, and everything would be on one system. Then we saw the rise of the multi-tiered applications. So we're really starting to piece together a lot of systems, and really there is, as we have here on the slide, there's no such thing as just being so good that you'll never fail. With so many moving parts, a lot of things can happen. So complex systems, aside from just having multiple tiers and connecting systems together, we're starting to talk about like diversity of systems and having things work interdependently. So as we talk about these, we start talking about things that we know we don't know as we piece things together. But with complex systems, we start diving into or getting into the realm of the unknown unknowns, where we just simply don't know what we don't know. And that makes issues that we encounter much harder to deal with simply because they're unexpected, because we don't know to expect them. So that leads into this framework that Dave Snowden ended up coming up with, and I'll let Jason Hand talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, this thing that Snowden has created for us is known as the Cynefin Framework. Cynefin is a Welsh word, but I could speak to this slide here for a good 30 minutes, but we're going to just talk about just some of the key and improve upon chaotic. Now, the systems that we build are most likely always going to be either complicated systems or complex systems. The stuff that we build aren't necessarily simple. The things that, as far as cause and effect, aren't always knowable until hindsight, so after the fact. But occasionally things do end up in the chaotic state, and when that's the case, the correct thing to do is simply act, and that way we can get out of the chaotic state, hopefully back into a complex state or complicated state. But the moral of the story for this slide here is that the systems that we build and maintain are either complicated, but most likely are going to be very complex. Understand that in complex systems, because there are a lot of unknown unknowns, and there's a lot of things that point to the fact that we can't really understand cause and effect until we do some sort of retrospective analysis. There's never really going to be a single cause of a problem. A lot of our systems are actually a lot of moving parts, like Jason said. And there's going to be contributing factors. There's going to be a lot of different stuff that may contribute to either the success of something or also the problems or the failures of things. And so it's important to understand that, especially when we start talking about root cause analysis and that kind of thing later on in this talk, that what we really do need to know and keep in mind is that the systems we build, there's a lot of different moving factors. We have to really keep in mind the systems thinking mentality and understand that there are many contributing factors to both success and failures of systems. So another important thing to note is recently there was a report that Puppet and DORA, the DevOps Research Institute or Research Association, put out the State of DevOps report, which they do every year. And one of the things that we really like to sort of highlight, because a lot of companies tend to miss this part, is that in today's sort of industry or in today's world, the systems that we're building, we're not really trying to engineer failure out of our system. We accept that failure is part of the systems, and so we no longer really try to make this scenario where we want to create a long time between failures, and so that we used to be paying attention to the mean time between failure, but what a lot of teams, a lot of organizations are doing these days are actually trying to focus more on the mean time to recover. In other words, we understand systems are complex, we understand there's going to be failures and there's going to be service disruptions. The quicker that we can detect those and respond to those and resolve those and actually recover our services, the better off we're going to be. And there's a lot of great numbers that show up in this year's State of DevOps report. I encourage you to go download that and take a look at it. They've actually been able to do a really good job of sort of calculating the cost of downtime, which plays very well with the stuff that both Datadog and VictorOps are trying to provide the industry out there. So The new focus now these days is actually the mean time to recover rather than the mean time between failure.
So with that, if our idea is to increase the time or increase the response time into detecting issues, that definitely helps us when we're trying to speed up the time that it takes to recover. One of the nice things about that report that Jason Hand was showing off was they use a baseline of $500,000 per hour of outage time, right? Which is actually a pretty reasonable number when you consider the losses that you're experiencing for what you're losing in revenue, and also the losses that you're spending having engineers dedicated to fixing things. But on the flip side, at Datadog, we like to say that collecting data is cheap. So the other day, I was actually on AWS, and I was looking at how much S3 storage buckets were. As a rough comparison, compared to $500,000 per hour for downtime, you can get 10 terabytes of S3 storage and be putting in data every second. And it comes out to only about $315 a month, which is less than $4,000 a year. So we're talking about a scale of 100 times here for what it actually costs. So on the flip side, storing your data is really cheap. So as we start to think about our mean time to recovery and repair, one of the most important pieces of this is gathering enough data and gathering the right data that you need in order to have a good resolution and to find these issues. A good framework for thinking about the metrics that you should be gathering and the data you should be gathering is there's sort of two types of metrics, and then there's events. So we like to think of things in terms of work metrics, and these are going to be your higher level, your top level indicators of health in your system. These include things like throughput, success, errors, and performance. Personally, I love donuts, so my example with donuts is that if we think about a donut factory, your throughput is like how many donuts are coming off the line. Success is how many good donuts can we sell versus ones that we just have to eat the cost on and maybe just eat. Error would be how many of those are the bad donuts, and then performance is really how efficient are we. And then a lot of people tend to focus purely on the resource metrics, particularly when it comes to infrastructure. They think of things like utilization. And in the donut example, that'd be how many raw ingredients do we have. But often people get obsessed with that. What's my CPU usage on my systems? But the thing is to keep in mind that the work metrics really should be our ultimate goal. Resource metrics really just help inform what's going on when we're seeing changes in our work metrics. And then finally, we like to think of events as discrete occurrences. So they're not actually metrics in the same terms of things like disk I/O or whether someone can get to your website. The events are what we actually try to correlate to understand what's changed in a system, because metrics in and of themselves don't naturally have drastic changes without correlating events. So using all three of these, we can start to drill down and find some of those problems. The issue, though, is that as we're gathering this data, not all metrics are created equal. There are qualities of metrics that we really want to seek out. As much as we like to say that you should instrument everything and get as much data as possible, there are good qualities, and you don't want to waste your time just gathering useless data. So the four qualities of really good metrics start with the first of being well understood. Right? And throughout your organization, understand what those metrics mean and understand why they're important. So the image that I've got here on this slide is actually of a rocket explosion. But a classic example of this is back in the 90s when NASA was sending up one of the first Mars rovers. They were working along with Lockheed Martin, and it was this classic example of not being on the same page. NASA traditionally uses metrics or metric numbers, and Lockheed Martin, being an American company, traditionally uses imperial. So there was this mismatch of some people thinking the numbers were in meters and some people thinking the numbers were in miles. So the Mars rover got sent off into space and the orbital trajectory was wrong and it just ended up flying out into the middle of nowhere, never to be heard from again. Along with being well understood, your metrics need to be granular. Recently, we had the Olympics down in Brazil. This is some of the times from the 50-meter freestyle for men's swimming. And granularity is important, right? Because if our granularity is on a 1 second time basis, all of these gentlemen have now won gold. They're all winners. So really defining what your granularity is and understanding how important that is. So if we talk about things like cloud hosting providers, we've got places like AWS and Azure and Google, and all of those actually only collect on a 1 minute basis. So 1 minute's fine if that's granularity that you need, but you need to understand that if you have a fast moving system, and you're experiencing 15 seconds of downtime, that could be highly important. But if you're using just a 1 minute granularity, you're going to end up missing a lot of that data and not seeing those outages. The third feature of metrics is that they should be tagged and filterable, right? Filtering allows you to actually be able to see what's there rather than seeing everything as one giant aggregate. So being able to tag your metrics as what availability zone or region they're coming from and what application they're coming from, be able to start slicing and dicing your data to see what's important. And then finally, your metrics really need to be long-lived. Again, talking about the major cloud providers, AWS will only keep your metrics around for 2 weeks. Azure does a roll-up, so beyond a certain time, they start aggregating your data and just averaging it out. So you end up losing that information. And as we'll discuss later on, when you're really doing post-incident analysis and the objective is to learn, if you're losing that data and it's not available, then it suddenly becomes unavailable to learn from that. So as we start thinking of the metrics and gathering good metrics and what sort of buckets or roles those metrics play, really when it comes to incidents, we start thinking about what should we be paging on, and really those are the high-level work metrics, right? It's keeping our end goal or our customer focus as a priority, but then using the rest of those metrics to investigate on, and then eventually using those to inform our incident analysis. So that brings us to diagnosing the problems, and I'll turn it over to Jason Hand to cover this.
Yeah, awesome stuff, Jason. And obviously the detection aspect of all this is super important and more or less step one with the on-call responsibility. But those of you who have been on call understand that there's a lot more to the story, a lot more to the responsibility of being on call than simply being alerted. There's a whole another several steps that you have to do, including triaging events, investigating what's going on, then identifying it and working through the problems there. But it all starts with that monitoring service, such as Datadog, detecting what's going on, and then in real time sending that over to a service like VictorOps so that the right people are notified about what's going on. And so it's about understanding the scenario that we detect something and then immediately send it over. And then from there, we start in with the diagnosis. So Jason, if you could switch to the next screen there. A big part of that diagnosis is going to start with making sure that the right people are involved. So making sure that not only do the right individuals and the right teams get paged or alerted, but they're alerted with something that's actually actionable. There's nothing worse than actually getting paged in the middle of the night over something that you can't actually do something about. So you want to make sure that those alerts are actionable and that they're getting to the right people. If there's something wrong with your database, you want to make sure that you get to your subject matter experts on the database types of things. So being able to route those alerts to the right people and then include the type of context and information that's going to be useful for that on-call engineer, whoever's actually responding, giving them that context, giving some of that data that that Jason was just talking about that you want to store for a long time. That helps build a story, and it helps you really understand and learn what's taking place. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the things that we see a lot of teams do is they start to incorporate that extra context and a lot of that information in the alert itself. So that could be something like graphs and screen boards or whatever from Datadog, as well as logs or runbooks. But the types of stuff that the person who's responding to some sort of service disruption, the types of stuff that they need, we want to give that to them immediately. And so we start to look at different ways to automate the actual on-call responsibility. And if Jason goes to the next screen, you'll see that one of the things that we built at VictorOps is this thing called the transmogrifier. And what it does is it allows us to bring in great, context-rich information from services like Datadog, but then also allow you to use and leverage things like chatbots to maybe take the initial first step at resolving or remediating some sort of a problem. So if you've got a situation where a host is having an issue, let that bot go out and take care of things. And a lot of this speaks to this greater topic, which I do write a little bit about and talk a little bit about, known as ChatOps. And ChatOps is really just the idea of taking your group chat tool, so something like HipChat or Slack, and then integrating in all of the different tools and services that you use. For example, Datadog and VictorOps, we've got integrations into all the major chat components out there in the chat tools. But you can also use a bot. Like I said, that previous image was a picture of Hubot, and you can have Hubot go out and do some of the heavy lifting for you. And so ChatOps has become sort of a very important process and part of the incident management lifecycle. If we go to the next screen, you'll see this is what we identify as the full lifecycle of dealing with incidents and service disruptions. And of course, on the front side of this, you've got Datadog detecting some sort of problem, and then we begin alerting the right individuals and the right teams. But you can see the alerting aspect is really only 5% of the entire lifecycle. The majority of things, the triaging, the investigation, and the identification, that's all part of what we call the diagnosis category. Those actually make up 73% of the entire lifecycle. So a majority of your time dealing with these outages, dealing with these problems, is during the diagnosis phase. And as we pointed out earlier, your mean time to recover is kind of what we're after. So the faster that you can be alerted and detected about these things, the quicker that you can start triaging and having the context from Datadog or wherever all there in front of you, the quicker you can actually begin to investigate, identify, and then resolve your issues. And so that's sort of our goal here, is to make sure that you understand that that's really today's sort of focus, is what can we do to reduce the time it takes to recover from a problem. And then, of course, the documentation phase is the last part of the incident lifecycle, and that's what mostly we wanted to talk about today in terms of the do's and don'ts. So if we go to the next slide, that's what I sort of wanted to just pause here for a second and let you know that a lot of what we've been talking so far is really to just sort of set the stage. But moving forward, we're going to talk about the actual post-incident analysis, the documentation phase of that life cycle. And so, Jason, if you want to, I think we're ready to just go ahead and dive in with the do's and don'ts of this webinar. Step number one, as you go into these post-incident analysis, and we can call those post-mortems if we'd like, or learning reviews, or whatever, semantics really doesn't matter, but the first thing you want to do as you go into these exercises is point out and make sure that everybody that's involved understands that we are here to learn. That is the primary objective of this entire exercise. And so it's really, really helpful to sort of set the stage by letting everybody know who's part of that we are simply here to learn and understand what
detected and the context leading up to that, identify who our responder anomaly was first were, who was pulled in to assist, start gathering information about our conversations and the actions that people took.
Yeah, establishing the timeline is very helpful. It helps people to understand exactly when things took place, when did we first notice something, who was first alerted to the problem. But then once we start actually discussing what's going on with the postmortem or with the incident in question, we want to make sure that the discussion doesn't get sort of steamrolled by one particular person or a group of people. So oftentimes having a moderator run this exercise, someone that has more of an objective sort of look on the entire situation, can be very helpful, especially for some types of incidents that might have been more of a severe nature, where there might be a lot of emotion involved, a lot of people that are sort of still steaming about what took place. Making sure that you get the opportunity for everyone to be heard, and therefore making sure that nobody is really sort of running the discussion alone is going to be very important.
So along with that, getting that timeline of events and allowing everybody to have a say, what are we actually trying to get their say on, and that's really just to describe from their perspective what happened, right? So we're trying to think of what services and components they were dealing with, how customers were impacted. So customers are also included in what we're talking about, rather than just having the perspective of our responders or the engineers affected. One thing that I like to equate this to is, if we're thinking about how investigators in other areas, for example, police deal with issues. If you think about a crime scene, the detective or investigator from the police department doesn't just go and talk with the first responders, whether those are firefighters or police on the scene. They're actually talking to all the witnesses around. They're talking to the victims if they can. So starting to think of incidents sort of in those same ways of talking not only to your responders, your engineers, but talking to your customers, the people that were affected, thinking of them as the victims, talking to the people who first identified an issue, thinking of those people as your witnesses. And this helps to build some accountability into the system by talking to those people just outside of your immediate engineering group.
Yeah, and to just sort of touch on what Jason mentioned there about accountability, a lot of times we hear people mention or use the term or phrase of we need to hold someone accountable. A lot of times when they say that, they actually don't mean accountable, because holding someone accountable actually just means holding them responsible for giving an account of what took place. So a lot of times people sort of confuse those two terms or those two phrases, but holding someone accountable simply means asking them to give an accurate account of what took place. And so that's why we wanted to point out that it's very important to describe what took place, rather than, on this screen here, you can say, see that we don't want you to explain what happened. And there's a subtle difference between describing what happened and explaining what happened. And one of the reasons why we want to avoid explaining is that this often leads to some bias. This often leads to blaming. It could be blaming others. It could be blaming ourselves. But when we can sort of take the mindset or take the frame of we don't want to explain, but rather describe what took place, we actually start to uncover the details in a lot more specific and sort of just true manner, rather than letting bias start to slip in as well as blame.
That's a great point that you pointed out, along with not blaming others. I think there is a tendency within the roles that we have to try to blame ourselves. But along with that, asking how things happened, right? Because it's much easier to understand the details when we ask how things happened, including the multiple contributing factors. So, when we start to think about particularly that self-blame of like, oh, I did this wrong, really understanding how the situation was, what was the context that made you think that something was maybe in a way that it actually wasn't. Because really, when it comes to learning, understanding the situations that we're in and understanding the information that we have to make decisions and how we can affect those is a key aspect to learning.
Absolutely, and sort of tied into that due of asking how, the alternate to that is don't ask why. And this, again, kind of speaks to what I mentioned previously is that when we start to ask why, a lot of times that can start to lead us down a path of blame or allowing certain types of bias to creep into our discussion about what's taking place. There's a gentleman out there, I'm sure many of you are aware or know of John Allspaul. He's currently CTO over at Etsy. He talks a lot about this stuff, a lot about the blameless culture and the just culture. We've got a couple of links at the end of the slides to some resources from John. But this is one of my favorite quotes. I believe this was from Velocity New York 2015, I want to say. But John had said, when we ask why, that's going to bring us to very mysterious incentives we have in the workplace. But if we focus more on the how, that brings us to the conditions that allow the event to take place to begin with. So to Jason's point, when we start asking how, we start to understand a lot more detail of what exactly took place, how things took place, and we don't really want to focus on the why because that takes us down a path that's really not helpful. I'm sure there's a lot of you familiar with the 5 whys analysis. This is part of very standardized root cause analysis. The 5 whys analysis, I'll say, is better than doing nothing at all, but be very, very careful of doing any kind of root cause analysis, especially if it's going to contain a lot of questions that are focused more on why. Because, like I mentioned, that does sort of lend itself to allowing cognitive bias to switch gears and start to make its way into the discussion, as well as blaming ourselves and blaming others. And sort of tied to this is really the idea of the contributing factors that we sort of touched on earlier, is when we take a more of a holistic systems thinking approach to understanding what took place after some sort of incident, we realize that there are a lot of moving pieces in our system. There's a lot of moving services. There's a lot of just things kind of contributing to the overall system to make it a lot more complex than maybe what we really understand. And so when we focus too much on single sources of failure and not really trying to understand the system as a whole, we miss an opportunity to really learn and seek out areas of improvement. So we do suggest that rather than focusing on maybe single failures, we want to focus on the contributing factors to some sort of issue. There's another guy out there, very well known in our space, especially in the incident management realm, named Sidney Decker. He's written a lot of stuff regarding human factors, and this is one of my favorite quotes from him regarding this topic, is that cause is not something found in the rubble. Cause is created in the minds of the investigators. And I think this makes a really good point that, especially when you're looking at something like a 5 whys analysis, if you ask 5 different people to do a 5 why analysis to uncover a root cause, you're likely going to find 5 separate root causes. There may be some overlap, but in general, you're going to allow the investigator to come up with what they believe the root cause is, rather than allowing the team to look at it in a more holistic view and understand all of the contributing factors. So hopefully that helps to understand a little bit more of why we're not as focused on root cause as much as we want to understand everything involved from a more holistic view.
So Jason did touch on the don't focus on a root cause, because there are many contributing factors. A few quotes that are really interesting along this line is Dave Zwiebach, who's another gentleman that talks a lot about postmortems and the human factors along with that, says that the root cause for both functioning and malfunctioning in all complex systems is impermanence. So it's the idea that we're dealing with a lot of dynamic systems and things are changing constantly, and that's great, because we all love dynamic infrastructure and the ability to use Puppet or Chef to instantly spin up an auto-scale infrastructure. But at the same time, that dynamicness is really what causes a lot of the issues that we have, simply because it's complex. Jason and I were both recently out at DevOps Days New York, and when we're talking about root causes, it was interesting. Somebody actually stated that doing root cause analysis on their systems uncovered that the first sunny day in the UK was the quote root cause of a dip in sales in their e-commerce system. When reality, it's hard to blame the weather for actual drops in sales. There's a lot going on when we're talking about people and thinking about causes in our systems.
Yeah, that was a really fun and interesting conversation we had at DevOps Days New York about that. But I think we had some good discussion that sort of led from that, and a lot of that is just really coming to a better understanding that we're the ones who've sort of created this idea that there is a single cause, and that cause actually is part of or is something that we're looking for, and that one thing leads to the actual sort of effect. It's sort of like a domino effect, where we used to believe that everything was very linear, but the more we're starting to understand complexity and complex systems, we understand that that's just really not the situation. I'm very well known for sort of RCA shaming or root cause shaming, just because really I think personally I've been in so many root cause analysis discussions. I've been part of the exercises. I've come up with corrective actions after these things, and I've realized over the years that honestly we weren't making our systems any better. We were just sort of putting them back the way they were. And I think for a lot of folks, they never really stop to think that their exercises with these root cause analysis, they're not really intended to improve our systems. They're really just intended to understand what broke and what we can do to fix that, and then sort of move on about our day. But one of the more important sort of things to keep in mind is that we really do want to improve our systems over time. We want to look for different incremental ways, even if they're small, looking for ways to improve the processes, our tools, our teams, our individuals. That's really what we're after. And so I can't emphasize enough how sort of dangerous it is to really focus on a root cause, and also how silly it is to say we're looking for the root causes. I think really the thing to keep in mind is that we're looking for all of the factors that may have played a role in both the success and failure of whatever incident we're investigating.
Along with those, trying to seek out a root cause, when we're looking into what were the contributing factors, we need to be careful about watching for biases. And one of those biases, anchoring, is one of the most common, and it's the idea that because people are seeking out, that one solution, that one thing that they can fix, that magic bullet. Anchoring is this bias that allows you to take a single fact that was part of the system and place way too much weight on that. It's almost similar to confirmation bias, which is where you see a fact and try to make that fit into the way that you believe a system acts. So there are a lot of biases that come about as we start talking and diving into incidents and analyzing them. A few others that tend to come up a lot are hindsight bias. Hindsight bias being the idea that someone should have done something, or why didn't they do this thing. It's why we tend to avoid asking why, because those whys and those should haves and could haves, they all set up really a false reality. It's an alternate reality, because had they actually been in the space that this reality that you're creating with that statement, of course they wouldn't have done that. A few other of the biases that come out are things like outcome bias, the notion that people's choices are good and bad based on the actual outcome of those choices. So for that type of bias, I like to point out, I love whiskey, and I could go out and drink a ton of whiskey and then go driving around. And drunk driving is not, definitely not a good decision, regardless of whether I get into a crash or not, right? So there's a separation between whether a decision's good and the actual final outcome of it.
Yeah, I think we could probably have an entire talk just on cognitive bias. We actually had a slide that we took out at the last minute that included all kinds of great visuals and different things about bias. And I just kind of wanted to just touch again on the hindsight bias that Jason was talking about. That's one that comes up a ton in post-incident analysis. The things like he mentioned, the shouldas or the couldas or the wouldas or things like those are actually known as counterfactuals. And we want to try to avoid those counterfactuals because they're things that didn't actually take place. And so they don't really have a place in these post-incident analysis because they're not helping us really understand what did take place and what we can do to improve. And so keeping in mind these cognitive bias are very, very important. It's also, I'll point out, we could have put this in here as another do, but it's important that you, as someone who's participating in these, that you watch out for cognitive bias in other folks, in other people, because it's very hard for us to spot our own cognitive bias. It's much easier for you to spot it in someone else as a third party. But a lot of this speaks to why our next don't here is that we don't blame humans. As humans, we are part of building and maintaining and improving these complex systems, and we're certainly part of the response. But we are fallible. You know, we do succumb to not only cognitive bias but also fatigue, whether that's alert fatigue or just regular sort of human fatigue because maybe we've been up for hours and working on some sort of problem. There's all kinds of things that play a role in us as humans and our ability to respond to and investigate and the entire diagnosis aspect of incidents. So we never want to go into one of these post-incident analysis and actually blame somebody else, or even worse in some cases, blame ourselves. Humans are only part of the problem, they're only part of the response. They're never actually going to be something that you can hang some sort of blame on. And they sort of even take that discussion a little further is if you do blame someone and the result of that blaming someone is to let them go because they made a mistake with either building or maintaining services, what you've done now is just fired someone who knows exactly what not to do or knows exactly how to bring the services back up if this type of situation happens again. And so a lot of people, especially kind of old view thinking management, in a lot of cases they're using that incorrectly, but it never does anyone any good, doesn't do a team any good, doesn't do an organization any good to blame humans or to let humans go for being part of a response and bringing services back up. Now that doesn't mean that you give everyone a free pass to make mistakes constantly, but we never want to go into these post-incident analysis blaming anyone, individuals, especially yourselves. So this part right here is why we could do an entire talk on just the blameless aspect of it.
So on the flip side of that, not blaming people for the actions that they took, we really do want in our post-incident analysis to include what went well, right? What did people do that went well? What processes do we have in place that encouraged good behavior? Because as much as we want to learn from failure, we also want to study our successes. A lot can be learned from what worked in a service disruption, so we want to capture that. Yeah,
one of my favorite sort of sayings from Dave Zwieback, who Jason mentioned earlier, is that in both success and failure, well, especially if we're talking about success, there's rarely going to be a single cause or a root cause or a single thing that contributed to the success of something. If we think about rolling out a new feature or just doing anything within our company that we sort of deem as a success, there's hardly ever one thing that was the cause of that success. There's a lot of things that were the cause of that. So that's another reason why we sort of want to understand both the good and the bad of what took place. Another aspect that's really important, and especially in the context of maybe a customer-facing postmortem or a public-facing postmortem, is that we don't want to hide what happened. We want to be very transparent about not only the contributing factors of what may have resulted in some sort of service disruption, but also what was our response like? What did it look like as we were trying to deal with this problem and restore services? our customers, our end users, are very savvy people, and they're going to know when there's a problem. They may even go online on the social media and start talking about those problems. But it definitely sort of makes things a lot worse if you as an organization attempt to hide what happened. So that's another don't that we suggest is you don't want to try to keep things from your end users. We want to make sure that we actually be very transparent and earn their trust.
So along with this, as we talked about before, that humans are often part of the problem and the response, because we are fallible. We want to do the post-incident analysis as soon as possible as we gather the team and try to get information. And part of that is simply because, humans have a limit to our memory. The first really involved memory study was done way back in the 1880s by a guy named Ebbinghaus, and he's become famous for this thing called the Ebbinghaus curve. And the notion is that really our memory drops off really exponentially within the first 2 days. So as we start thinking about when should we do a post-incident analysis, getting that done and getting that information as quickly as possible is important. He also found that the flip side was true. As our memory drops off, we tend to have this exponential rise in the ability to take on false memories, or to start to report or remember things that weren't actually part of the incident. So that's another reason that we want to conduct these analyses as soon as possible.
Yeah, the illusion of memory, the illusion of confidence, those are things that are certainly things we have to keep in mind. You do want to conduct those postmortems as quickly as possible, but sometimes they happen in the middle of the night, they happen at off hours, they may happen on weekends or holidays, and so you're not actually going to be able to kick off your post-mortem or whatever it is the very next morning. So how long are we allowed to wait? Well, obviously it kind of depends on your situation, but from most of the people that we talk to, anything longer than 48 hours probably isn't going to result in much learning and understanding and improving. And the reason is, sort of Jason already touched on, is that our memory and our ability to sort of pull an accurate account of what took place begins to diminish very quickly and escalates very quickly the longer the time passes. So we want to be able to capture this as quickly as we can. Approximately 2 days, 48 hours or so is about what we sort of suggest, but we don't want to see this go longer than 48 hours before you begin your exercise, because you will begin to lose information about what took place.
So since we're here to learn, assign actionable items, right? Learning really isn't very good if we're not actually putting anything into play and actually acting on those. So as we start to think about the action items and things that we should pull away from an incident analysis, really look for the small incremental improvements to take on. And then assign each of those to an owner and insert those into your issue tracking system, whether you're using Trello or Jira or any of those tools. Those will allow you to actually have some responsibilities there that you could start to take away.
Yep, and related to that, we don't want to just conduct some sort of meeting where everybody comes in and debates what took place or complains about things. And certainly we mentioned we want to avoid all the blame. So we don't, we want to make sure that we don't go into these things and not have some sort of actionable items. And a lot of teams will actually use this idea of a parking lot, so that as they're getting ideas from everybody that's involved, maybe they're not sure which items they want to act on just yet. But they put all those items into a parking lot. So I think it's important to at least capture those ideas, make sure that you're coming up with actions. You're not just debating what took place and then not having something to take action and follow up with after that.
So as we start to come up with these action items, we want to ensure that we're hearing from everybody, that we're understanding everything that's going on, getting everybody's experience. Because again, as we talk to more people and get more buy-in and more voices, we'll start to be able to definitely come up with a more concrete idea, an accurate idea of what happened, and then be able to derive actually useful action items from that.
And related to hearing from everyone is that we want to encourage everybody who takes place in these or takes part in these to provide what they think should be new improvements. The more voices we get from a lot of different people who are involved in not only the response, but maybe also some of our social media and marketing people who may have a pretty good idea of what the reaction was online, we want to hear from all of them. We want to understand what their improvements are. This allows us to get more sort of feedback from people outside of our own little group, and we can avoid that group thinking type of mentality. So we do suggest that you encourage a lot of different improvements from a lot of different folks. And another thing to keep in mind as far as when you start to establish the action items is that you don't want to overpromise or overcommit on something. So we're looking for a ton of ideas, a lot of ideas for incremental improvement, but we're not necessarily creating commitments just yet. Jason spoke to the idea that we do want to come up with actionable items, but make sure that these suggested improvements and the things that we're going to do are actually something that we can do, and we're not suggesting something that's going to be too difficult to actually pull off.
So as we start to gather these action items and they're getting done, we want to ensure that we archive these postmortems, right? That the learning is available for everyone in the organization in the future. Because as people see incidents that are similar, we want them to be able to just look back and see how things in the past were resolved and start to correlate. And as we talk about gathering data and being able to look at archive postmortems will start to allow us to see trends in the incidents that we're experiencing, trends in how we're responding, and hopefully seeing improvements based on the action items that we have.
And then our last suggestion here for the do's and don'ts of post-incident analysis is really the idea that you need to do this consistently, you need to do this regularly. These are not necessarily only for really bad outages. Of course, some sort of Sev1 outage. You certainly want to do some sort of post-incident retrospective. But even for small things, and certainly for things that didn't really seem to be too bad, we just want to get into the habit of running these exercises so that we can learn. And if we only do them for either really big outages or problems that we think are only suitable for this type of thing, we don't build that discipline of actually performing these things on a regular basis. And as we know, with just about everything, the more you practice at something, the more you become comfortable with it, the easier and more natural these things become. And if the whole point of doing these is to actually learn what took place, learn and understand our response, as well as what the system was doing, so that we can incrementally improve it over time, the more we do this and the more comfortable we are with it, the better the results we're going to get.
So I'm going to dive into a framework here, since we mentioned that. It's actually, as Jason talks about the rinse and repeat, at Datadog we actually have a recurring meeting. It's a monthly recurring meeting where we recap the postmortems that have gone on, but we follow this framework for each of those that I think touches on the things that we've covered and provides some of that detail. So I'm going to run through this really quickly. We've also got a document that we've shared, and that link will be in the end, so you can actually get a copy of this and start implementing it in your own organizations. But again, I want to run through this quickly just so that we can have some time at the end for some questions. So basically, our framework revolves around 5 key areas. The first is the summary of what happened, and then we start getting into how it was detected and how we responded, a deep dive technically, and how we can improve. So within the summary, we want to keep that focus on our end customers in mind. So we start with the impact on our customers. How did our customers actually experience the incident? Then we catalog the severity of it, what components were affected, and then ultimately what resolved the incident, just at a high level, because this is the summary. So it allows everybody in the organization to just read the summary and get an idea of what happened. And then finally, we include any externally shared information. We want to be transparent. So we link to, we use status page IO, but if you're posting those to your corporate blog or your engineering blog, that would be the other place to share that information. In part 2, we dive into how the incident was detected, right? Because our idea is to try to speed up that mean time to recovery. We want to ensure that we're detecting incidents and that we're getting on them quickly. So we asked so that somebody was getting alerted about that quickly. And then finally, we track how long did it take to declare an incident. So this is one thing where keeping these postmortems around for a long time, you can hopefully start to see trends where the length of time that it takes to declare incidents starts getting shorter and shorter. Then we dive into the how did we respond, right? So this is where we catalog who was involved, who was our incident commander, who else was involved in this, who was the first person that witnessed or reported the incident. We link to chat ops, so we use Slack internally. We'll link to that archive, and then we'll include a timeline of events outside of just that Slack archive. And then, as mentioned in our do's and don'ts, we do want to record what went well. We want to record the successes that we have and the processes that we want to promote. And then we also record what didn't go so well, right? So these are the things that we had friction on, and we want to address these and bring these back later to fuel the tasks that we have to improve our processes. The fourth section that we have is the how did it happen, and this is really the technical deep dive. We want to be sure to include context here. What was the state of our systems leading up to the incident actually happening? And here's where we want to be sure to include the contributing factors and remember to ask how and not why. And then the final section, the most important, is the actionable items. So we like to break this down into 3 major parts. The immediate action items that need to happen in order to prevent a recurrence of the incident. And then we have the next. And next is things that we classify as things that should happen in the current or the following sprint. So items that we want to ensure get done relatively soon. And then finally, we have the later, because oftentimes if you have a major incident, it may bring up issues in the architecture of your system or your application, things that require much more planning or a lot more buy-in or information sharing across an organization. So you want to ensure that you have an actionable task for those, but you allow the time to do the proper planning. And then the fourth part that we have within our improvement section is just follow-up notes, because as you start to work on these action items, they're going to bring up some other issues, and you want to be sure to catalog those notes and have some feedback and some dialogue about those. And then just a final reminder that we want to ensure that these are all actionable and tracked. So anything that we put in this section, we want to ensure that there's a JIRA ticket for, or a Trello card for, some way that we can ensure that it doesn't slip off of people's radar and we don't just go back to business as usual.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I was just going to say, just to summarize, but I'll let you take that away, Jason Hand.
Well, I know we're getting close to the end of but maybe we've been able step guide on how to do hard to provide, because it really depends on the culture of your company. It depends on sort of the environment that you're in. And so Jason and I thought that it might be better to just not only step through the do's and don'ts, the definitely the things that are for sure things to keep in mind, but also provide you with the framework that Jason just stepped through. But we wanted to put this into a document that you could download and have available for you as well. So if, Jason, you want to go to the next slide there, you'll see the very first bullet here, our post-incident analysis framework. If you go to that link, that'll just be a PDF that you can download. It's very basic, but hopefully it includes all the things that Jason was just talking about, but in a little bit more detail. And then we've also got some other resources. We talked about John Allspaw and Dave Zwiebeck. They both have written a lot of stuff about this topic. We encourage you to go check those out. There's another post on Medium there included as well that's really good. And so, there's tons of resources. This is just a couple of them, but please reach out to either one of us, either on Twitter or through email. I'd love to, help out however I can. And I think with that, we're pretty much starting to wrap up here. I know we've got a couple of questions that hopefully our moderators can pass along to us. But with that, I would just say thank you very much, and we can switch it over to any questions that we may have.
Thank you guys so much for that presentation. That was really wonderful. We did have a couple of questions come in. Let me just see if I can, we've been vetting through a few of them. And we'll see how many we have time for. But let's start off with, is it necessary and or beneficial to conduct postmortems on all events, or should they just be run for significant incidents?
I can touch on this one because I think I briefly mentioned it towards the end. We feel that it is important to do these types of analysis on pretty much every incident that comes across. And the reason is not so much that we want to come up with actionable incremental improvements for each and everything, but it's a habit building thing. It's a way to sort of engage discipline and get really good at conducting these postmortems and these after action reports, so that we can actually, no matter the size or the scope of whatever type of issue that's come up, you're very well practiced and very well rehearsed at conducting these types of things.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And then along with that, as you start to think of postmortems, we mentioned studying success. When you make a postmortem or a post-incident report and you're doing it on something that went really well, that also helps to break down that aversion to doing these, right? Because traditionally, if you only do it with the major outages, then it becomes this process that just reminds you that whenever you do it, something awful has happened. When you start to look at your smaller incidents that aren't so painful, or even your successes, then it really turns this from a post-incident or post-mortem analysis into just a learning review or something that you're learning from.
Awesome. I think those were great answers. Also, just a quick PSA, I'm getting a couple questions about if we're going to be sharing slides and if we're going to be posting links. I'll have our presenters post links or share links with the audience that they mentioned before we get off the webinar. And in terms of the slides, they will be available once the actual webinar is recorded and ready to view on our YouTube link as well as on VictorOps.com. So I hope that answers your questions there. Let's see, another question that we have. Should there be a defined postmortem team, or should it only include members of teams that were affected by an incident?
I'll take this one, and then Jason, you can chime in as well. We suggest that you pretty much invite anyone who was involved with the incident at all, or has some sort of stake in the discussion of what took place. And so in a lot of cases, it seems to be habit that we just invite our engineers, just people who were actually on call, the first responders, the incident commanders, and that type of thing. But actually, we want to hear from a lot of folks. We want to hear from everybody who was involved. So that may even mean bringing in some of your salespeople, bringing in your social media manager, your customer success team, anybody who has some ideas and some actual input into what took place throughout that service disruption. You want to hear from them as well, because they may know something that the engineers didn't realize. Maybe it's really important to understand that Twitter was blowing up with a lot of unhappy customers, and so we want to hear from our social media team and understand that as well, because maybe there's something we should be doing better about communicating to our customers when we are experiencing an outage. And so that's an area of an improvement that isn't necessarily technical or related to our system or even the service we've built, but it's an area of improvement that we've just uncovered, but only because we invited or just invited certain members of the company into those post-mortem analysis.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. When you're having the analysis done, bringing in as many people as possible. I think I mentioned earlier about equating it to a crime scene and how an investigator will actually talk to everybody involved, including the victims, which would be a large time would be your end customers. So it's starting to get some of their perspectives, and obviously you don't have to invite them into the office to sit in this meeting. Most of them probably won't do that with you, but actually pulling in some of their quotes or emailing them to get some of their experience of what happened. And then when we start thinking about sharing postmortems, after we've gathered that the incident information, sharing those across an organization is largely beneficial. So, I mentioned that we at Datadog have a recurring postmortem meeting, and that includes all of engineering and to see what you did from a technical perspective and provide insight on perhaps might be those contributing factors or some of those interdependent parts of your system.
Great, and I think we have
the Cynefin model, and one of the components about having complex systems is the approach that they suggest taking is to act and then to evaluate and then respond, because complex systems generally don't have that linear cause and effect. So really, I think that is the notion, is that if you're following, I want to call them DevOps practices, but really if you're involving rapid deployments and continuous deployments and improvements, the idea that you might have these unintended consequences, generally that makes that slightly okay or better, more acceptable, because you'll be able to spot those if you have proper monitoring, and you'll be able to quickly address those if you're deploying more frequently.
Yeah, I don't really have anything additional to add to that. Jason's spot on. That's a big reason why I mentioned earlier we can talk forever just about the Cynefin framework, because it really does help us understand in an illustrated way the types of systems we're building, the ordered and unordered aspects of them. We mentioned that they're complex and complicated. Those that are complex are full of emergence and emerging things, whereas we're used to using language like best practices, and that's just something that doesn't really apply to either complicated or complex environments. Being able to bring in expert opinion, expert ideas, and get as many of those voices together in retrospect is actually really the only way to understand what took place and what we can do to improve. And like we've mentioned many times, looking for areas of improvement is the single goal of these exercises. We're not really looking to just identify one thing that broke. We're looking at it in a more holistic view.
Great, and then one more question before we wrap up. One that just came in. ChatOps was mentioned briefly and Slack was mentioned as a tool. Can you elaborate if when a high severity call is initiated for an incident, everyone just joins a chat room without a conference call bridge? How does that work?
I can jump on this one first because this is something that comes up quite a bit. Obviously, VictorOps is used for a lot of companies to manage their incidents and the conversations. We've got a feature built into ours called, well, it's a conference calling feature for automatically creating those phone bridges. But the problem we see with those, even though we have a lot of people asking for that feature, is that the conversations that take place on those call bridges are completely lost. Unless you have someone dedicated to scribing and documenting what was said and who said what at exact times so that it fits into the timeline and it fits into the story, it's really difficult to understand who did what, who said what, and that type of thing when there's a phone bridge. Now that's not to say we discourage a phone bridge. We just discourage using it as the only source of a conversation. So we highly recommend all conversations, everything that's being said, everything that's being done, be done within something like Slack or HipChat so that it is all documented. And that way it's really easy to take those conversations and include them in your post-incident analysis and include them in your post-mortem because it's all documented in real time with timestamps, exactly who said what, exactly who said or who did what. And that's very valuable information, and if you aren't capturing it, it's going to be really hard to rely on your memory and go back and include all that stuff in very granular detail in your post-incident analysis.
I completely agree. Just thinking about the most recent incident that I actually experienced, I started in Slack, and so that was linked in my post-incident analysis. But I did jump into a Google Hangout with one of the other Datadog engineers, and we started to discuss some of the issues. I started writing my post-incident analysis almost immediately after we resolved the issue, which, within an hour of that, basically I took a break for lunch just to cool down and then dove right into it. And even within that short time period, being able to capture what we talked about at a granular level was completely lost. So, my post-incident analysis just kind of contained a high-level overview of what we discussed. For my incident, which was rather small, that wasn't necessarily a huge loss. I ended up covering most of it. But if we're starting to talk about larger incidents, you do lose so much if you're not actually having someone take notes or, transcribing what you're discussing.
Yeah, a lot of cases, even here at VictorOps, because we all work in the same office for the most part, it's really easy to just turn and begin having a conversation with your teammates about what's going on and who's looking at what. But sometimes we have to stop and catch ourselves and remind each other that while those discussions are fine, we really need that detail to make it into either VictorOps or into Slack, so that the conversation is documented, because we're going to want to review that during the post-incident analysis. And if myself and another engineer are just discussing it out openly, it's very difficult to go back and capture that later and put that into your analysis.
Great. So that concludes our Q&A session for today, as well as our webinar. So a big thank you to Jason for such a great presentation today, and for everybody who attended for all of the questions and comments that came through. I hope that we were able to answer a majority of them. And of course, if you have any questions after this, please feel free to reach out to our presenters. I believe their information were in the slides. Also, as a reminder, the webinar has been recorded, and it will be made available to you via email and on demand, as well as on VictorOps within the next few days. So thank you again for attending, and have a great day. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.